Toronto Star. I'm Reggie Mudler, and this matters. It is a story that spans over 150 years, crosses 2 continents, and affects the legacy of 2 famous doctors. But more importantly, it attempts to reconcile a rift between cultures that starts with bodies being taken from their burial place. We have a different sort of episode for you today, and one that beyond all those numbers will detail an investigation that started over 2 years ago, when 2 doctors found some notes in an archive that led them on a quest to find 4 Indigenous skulls that had been removed from where they had been buried in Canada. David Bruser is the investigations editor at The Star, and he joins us to talk about this fascinating story that starts in the past but still remains relevant for many reasons, as you will hear. David, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So David, this is a really, really fascinating story. We have a lot of characters and we are looking back. And I think that a really good place to start is with William Osler and Rudolf Virchow. Who were these guys?
2 very famous doctors, to put it bluntly. Virchow, pathologist among many other talents and pursuits, was one of Osler's teachers when Osler was a postgrad student in Europe. When Osler went to visit him in 1884, Osler himself was already quite well known and becoming more and more famous for his contributions to medicine. He would later be dubbed the father of modern medicine, in part because of his popularization of bedside teaching.
Now, Osler is revered. We have the William Osler health system here in the region, but his legacy is starting to be looked at a different light, and it's led by 2 other doctors who are also integral to the story. Can you tell me a little bit about them and the discovery that sort of kicked this whole thing off?
Yeah, these 2 Toronto doctors, Philip Berger and Nav Prasad. As an interesting side note, Berger was Prasad's mentor, just like Virchow was Osler's mentor. And so Berger and Prasad, along with a 3rd co-author, recently published an article, it was earlier this year, that delved into some of Osler's own words and writings, basically finding that Osler held racist views that have been swept under the carpet for more than a century. And as part of their research, they learned from Osler's own writings that in 1884, he gave 4 Indigenous skulls as a gift to Virchow.
William Osler was one of the architects of modern medicine. He helped to design the medical schools that train physicians today. And he's regaled and celebrated for his love of humanity. But I think a more careful look at this particular incident and William Osler's actions in general could give some insight into racism in medicine today, and particularly into anti-Indigenous racism in medicine today. William Osler was a very well-educated, successful physician who became the first physician-in-chief at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore and later became the Regis Professor of Medicine at the University of Oxford. He moved in elite circles. He was very well-read, and he would have been aware at the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s that Indigenous rights were a prime issue of the time. They would be making front page news. This was the time of numbered treaties. It was the time of Louis Riel. It was a time when Indigenous people were fighting for their land, fighting for their lives. And William Osler would have known about it. He did not decide to go to Mount Pleasant Cemetery and take remains of white people to Germany as a present. What he did decide to do is take remains of Indigenous people to Germany as a present to a physician he admired. That wasn't the only instance of anti-Indigenous racism exhibited by Osler.
So they tried to find out what they could. They were interested in trying to find out more about the skulls. They contacted the German Anthropological Society that held Virchow's collection of human remains. They wanted to know, was there any paperwork that could shed some light on the skulls, where they originated, what happened to them? The museum basically said they had no relevant records, but would take a deeper look. And these 2 doctors, Berger and Prasad, felt that deeper look never happened. And so they reached out to the Toronto Star to see if it was something that the Star thought was in the public interest, and we thought that it was.
David, I think this is a really, really great point. Before we go any further, why do you think it's important to attempt to reclaim or discover where these remains are?
Well, I didn't pretend to have that answer or to have that kind of knowledge. So one of the things that we did is consulted leaders in Indigenous artifacts and medicine, and even found a distant relative of Osler, who is herself now a very prominent doctor. And they all agreed that we should pursue information on these skulls, and that if the skulls still exist, they should be returned to the culture of origin. I think the prevailing opinion among these experts we consulted was these remains are someone else's ancestors, and it seems like the right thing to do, to look for information about them. And if we find them, if the museum turns out has them, the museum should send them back.
So what was the next step here?
Yeah, after we talked to some experts and peoples whose opinions we thought would really help shape our thinking on some of these issues, we at the Star partnered with an investigative journalist based in Germany. His name is Marcus Grill, because we really just felt that sometimes there's a limit to how much we can accomplish, how much information we can get when we're only relying on emails and phone calls. And so Marcus was able to put some shoe leather on the ground and try to further our inquiries.
Since a couple of years, I'm working as healthcare journalist. That means in this time, nothing else than Corona. But originally, I've studied history. And so from the beginning, I was very interested in this story. I've never heard before anything about human skulls stored in depots in Berlin. Then I read in the archive that there are several thousands of skulls and that there is a political discussion about it. A few years ago, Germany also returned several skulls to Namibia. So I thought that is definitely worth looking for these Canadian skulls.
I think this is one of these things where, like many investigations, you kept the pressure on for a couple of years. You've gone through all these official routes, but I think with every investigation or, story, sometimes there's a few lucky breaks. And Marcus may have had some in this case. Can you tell me a little bit about what you think they were that were sort of the breakthroughs in this story?
To me, there's really one big break. You're right, there were a few, but the one big break, the turning point, I think, was Marcus finding, for lack of a better way to describe it, the Skull and Remains ledger book that itemized what was in Rudolf Virchow's collection.
I went to the archives from the Berlin Anthropological Society, and then the man who runs the archive said the same thing he told before to the Canadian doctors, that they don't have anything about Osler, this famous Canadian doctor. But I said to him, let's look more detail in the database and researched the database for various terms, including Canada, and came across a handwritten book, inventory list, which on the front page is written skulls from the Rudolf Virchow collection. And there were more than 1,000 human remains listed here. And after page 22, there were 4 entries that they had the keyword Canada in them. And I photographed this page with my cell phone and looked at the photos again later when I was in my office. And I also discovered there that one of the skulls had the name Robert Bell, the name of the geologist who had given Osler the skulls before. Then I immediately and excitedly informed my colleague at the Toronto Star, because I thought this must be it.
This was a lucky find in part because others before us had tried to find a trace of these 4 skulls but failed. And they may have even looked at this book but missed the relevant reference, because the 4 skulls were not itemized in this book as being from Osler, but from R. Bell, who was Dr. Robert Bell, who we knew from our research was the guy who Osler asked for skulls before he went on his trip to Berlin in 1884.
I talked to Marcus, and one of the things that he mentioned was that there was a story in Germany from a couple of years ago where some remains were returned to Namibia. And one of the things that was interesting is that you reached out to these institutions that you believed had them. And at first they were initially rebuffed, but then it didn't seem to take that much effort, despite the fact that there are signatories from these institutions that say that it's important to return these type of remains. What do you think about that and the response that you initially got in trying to track these things down?
Well, it was the response that the 2 Toronto doctors got that I think in part motivated us to continue the search and try to find these skulls. It was the 2 Toronto doctors, the present day doctors, who felt like their inquiries were not treated as promptly or as in-depth as they would have liked, but not just as they would have liked, but as they felt the situation required. And as they felt this moment in European museums required. I mean, you're right. A lot of these museums have talked about and have been part of position papers that get into an awareness that some of these museums hold items that were taken during colonial eras and how they should treat these items, respect them, be transparent about them, and how to respond when there are inquiries about them. And these two modern-day Toronto doctors did not feel that the responses to their inquiries measured up to how the European museums say they should respond to such inquiries. When we got involved, we being the Toronto Star and Marcus Grill in Germany, to the Anthropological Society's credit, when Marcus met one of the officials at an event in Germany, and we continued to apply the pressure to find answers about these skulls, they did finally extend an invitation for Marcus to go to the archives to search for documentation.
We'll be right back. So Marcus finds this notation of Bell. I talked to him about it. He says how incredibly excited he was, and then he confirmed it. How did you feel when he told you that there was this breakthrough?
I was excited because we've been looking and it seemed like a find that was despite all odds. I never really was convinced that we'd actually find the skulls. And at this point, I didn't know what Marcus would later find out. And this ledger book really started a paper trail that led to something much more substantial. This ledger book had a numbering system in it, and only by finding that and identifying the right 4 ledger entries that corresponded with our Bell were we able to move on to a separate set of records, which were index cards. And those index cards detailed that 2 of the skulls actually originated from Grand River, Caledonia. And on Marcus went following the paper trail, which ultimately led to a building on the outskirts of Berlin where Virchow's skull collection remains to this day, and where ultimately he was able to see the skulls and confirm that they still exist.
Initially, I think you went into this thinking that these 4 skulls and the remains from BC. Now it comes from a place a lot closer to us. How does that sort of change the story for you? And then what inquiries did you do from there?
Having the detail of where at least 2 of the skulls originated, I mean, the first thing I thought to do with that was, well, I got to call Six Nations, the area around, including Caledonia and Grand River, and see if there's anyone there who can help us make sense of this find and whether they have any reaction, thoughts, or comments about it. And fortunately, that process led us to someone named Rick Hill, who'd spent decades, among other pursuits, doing exactly this kind of work, repatriating remains and artifacts. And it was only through this process that we got to really understand the full significance of these existing remains in Germany and what they mean to Six Nations today.
Well, my name is Rick Hill. I'm a Tuscarora, one of the Six Nations. We call ourselves the people of the Longhouse. We lived in upstate New York and then expanded out to Ontario and Quebec. So we're really one people, and we have a common tradition. And one of those elements of that tradition is having a respect for the dead and treating them as if, kind of like they're still alive, they're still around us, they're still part of us, so we're connected to them. I think it was about 1973, I started working for a small museum in Buffalo, New York. And they had on an exhibit actual human skeleton as it was found in a grave. And it was a native person from Western New York, probably maybe 1,000 years old. And they presented it as a teaching tool, but I don't know, it just really bothered me when I walked in and saw this there. Fortunately, I was successful in getting those remains not only taken off exhibit, but eventually returned to Seneca community for reburial. And that started me on this path of helping to recover remains that are in museums, universities, and private collections.
And this opened up a whole other line of inquiry and understanding and significance to the pursuit of finding these 4 skulls.
Can you talk about that a little bit? You've been on the chase, you've now got proof, and now you've even found more about their meaning. Why are they more important now?
Well, the first clue that they were important to someone, to some people, was after presenting the evidence we found to Rick Hill, we set up a time to do an interview about a week later, and he revealed that he had been in retirement, and he found the work of repatriating remains to be tiring and draining and sad. And he revealed that he had just come out of retirement to take on this one more case, because rarely, he said, do you have evidence that's so clear and compelling and from the museum's own records. And he went on to talk about why human remains from Six Nations are still important to Six Nations today.
But I felt honor-bound to somehow address these matters. And if I had to step forward and touch the bones, clean them up, rebundle them up, take care of them, then I felt that that was my duty, not only to my ancestors, but to the future. Because you have to think of this as, this is one of the original wounds between our people. Colonists first arrived when they began to dig native graves looking for whatever goods they could find. And ever since then, it seems like the graves of native people have a different standard. It's okay to dig them up. It's okay to claim the remains. It's okay to possess remains of native people, where the same isn't true for others. So there was a sense of justice, kind of a cultural and spiritual obligation. All of that came into play, and that led me on a road to basically, I would say for about 40 years, being involved in the recovery of human remains and objects that are buried with people, as well as other sacred objects in museums all across North America.
And now that they've been found, that it has opened up a dialogue, it has opened up a line of communication that cannot be ignored, and that Rick Hill said has made it incumbent upon him to do what he can to get these remains back home.
Where are they right now? Where are things at? Where are the skulls, and what happens next?
Well, Rick Hill has drawn up what he calls a case statement, something he's done many times before. It's basically putting the evidence into a document with a request to repatriate the remains, and he's got to send it through his chain of command, which is to Six Nations Governing Council. We are told that that case statement's been sent to council. It's not clear if they've seen it, what they're going to do with it. If they approve it, presumably that statement will be sent along to the Anthropological Society that still holds for cows' remains, for cows' collected remains. And it's not clear if that happens, how the Anthropological Society will respond. There are some indications that the protocol or the way that they've done things previously is they only deal with national government. So it's not clear if they would consider Six Nations a government in the way that they mean it, or if they would need to hear from Canadian officials in Ottawa. So there are some unknowns. What is known, because Marcus has laid eyes on them, is that the 4 skulls are in storage in this building on the outskirts of Berlin. And there they sit, I think Rick Hill would say, languishing, with black marker on the forehead and the side of the skull, where someone in some year past, it's not clear when, put a number on them and wrote on the side in German words that translate roughly to excavated skull of an ancient Indian, Caledonia, Grand River. And that's where those skulls remain for now.
David, I think this is a really remarkable story and different type of investigation than we normally do. You've been involved for almost, a year and a half, I think 2 years. What do you find remarkable about this story? I know one of the things that you mentioned to me was just a difference in how remains were treated over the last 150 years and how we're reacting now. But yeah, what do you find interesting or surprising about this from your perspective?
Yeah, this story is about human remains, yes, about how they were treated as a gift 150 some years ago and how important those remains are to the culture of origin today. But the story to me is also about, and more importantly to Rick Hill and others we interviewed, the story is about Indigenous relations with Canada. And there's some big picture significant issues with this story as well. The story is about European museums and their possession of artifacts taken during colonial eras and what they say about how they treat those remains and whether their actions measure up to their words. It's also about how 2 modern day Toronto doctors started to search for these elusive remains that originally changed hands between 2 other doctors many years ago. There are a lot of interesting things, I think, going on with this story, and all of them were, entirely new to me when I started this process. And, I feel like I've learned a lot just going on this journey with Marcus in Germany.
Well, David, I really, really want to thank your time for sharing this story with us. I think it's fascinating. Obviously, I'm sure we're going to follow it further, but I just was wondering, is there anything that I didn't ask that you think that our listeners should know?
There isn't. I hope that anyone who can read the story or if they can hear any audio of Rick Hill, I think he's a really important source to listen to hear in his own words, to hear him explain why pursuing the repatriation of these remains is important.
On that note, David, I really, really want to thank you for your time today and for this investigation.
Thank you very much for your interest.
David Bruser is the investigations editor at The Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Raju Mudler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etizaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fosa. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.